and thank you for watching this discussion on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission's latest research project on accessibility for voters with disabilities. The EAC is charged under the Help America Vote Act to maintain and improve accessibility within elections. As part of our work to fulfill that duty, the EAC has commissioned research studies such as the one we'll discuss today, in addition to developing resources and compiling the best practices to assist election officials as they serve this growing segment of the population. In 2021, the EAC collaborated with a team of expert researchers from the Program for Disability Research at Rutgers University to analyze the 2020 election experience for voters with disabilities amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Later in the year, the EAC built on that report with Rutgers and released a fact sheet on disability and voter turnout in the 2020 election that analyzed data from the U.S. Census Current Population Survey Voting and Registration Supplement. The issue of the lack of internet access, particularly for voters with disabilities, and its potential impact on voter turnout struck the EAC as a topic that needed further exploration to better assist officials as they communicate with residents and voters in their communities. The result of those discussions is the report, Disability, the Voting Process, and the Digital Divide, which we'll explore more in this video. This study looks at the role the internet plays in accessing voting information for people with and without disabilities. The internet and online resources have become valuable tools for election officials as they communicate with voters and raise awareness about elections and any changes in the registration and voting process. But online communications cannot be the only tool used to reach voters. As we'll explore today, there's a significant gap in the access to the internet for voters with disabilities, and other communication tools may be more effective in reaching members of that community, of this community. This video will include presentations from the team at Rutgers who led this study and a brief question and answer period to dive deeper into the takeaways and applications of this data. Joining the discussion today are Professor Lisa Schur and Doug Kruse, who are co-directors of the Program for Disability Research at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. Also joining the discussion is Dr. Mason Ameri, Associate Professor of Professional Practice at the Universities of Rutgers Business School. I'd like to thank Rutgers for their work and contributions to research on voters with disabilities. I hope that this research and resources the EAC plans to develop as the result of the findings will be helpful to election officials as they serve voters in their communities and ensure all Americans have the ability to vote privately and independently. When it comes to serving voters with disabilities, we often think about options to cast ballots and making sure polling locations are accessible. These are critical aspects of election administration. And as the research the EAC and Rutgers released in 2021 showed, election officials have been making progress over the last few decades to address the needs of voters with disabilities. But there's still progress that can be made in terms of helping this portion of the voting population register and vote. Understanding how voters with disabilities find information and their perception of the accessibility of those communications is critical to help election officials improve planning. Election offices often work with limited budgets. Funds dedicated to communicating with the public with mailings, paid advertising, and online research can be limited. So officials are often looking for ways to make sure these efforts are as effective as possible. This report on the digital divide gives insight on how communications with voters with disabilities and those without disabilities can be made more effective and help officials, regardless of jurisdiction size and budgets, reach their communities. Thank you to Rutgers for their work. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Vice Chair Christy McCormick.
Thank you, Chairman Hicks. Election officials across the country have many responsibilities within election administration, in addition to their other responsibilities in the community. With those many competencies are ADA compliance and communications. As election offices strive to reach voters effectively and efficiently, it's important to know how and where voters are getting their information. While disseminating information online through official election office websites or social media pages may reach the majority of voters, there's a segment of the population that does not have access to the internet. We first discussed the disparity in internet usage between people with and without disabilities in our last EAC Rutgers panel on the results of the survey on accessibility during the 2020 election. We commissioned this survey to help election officials understand the gap in internet connectivity, referred to as the digital divide, and how it impacts voters. It is our hope that the results of this survey will help election officials look at their own communications and consider how they utilize various tools to educate and build trust with voters, including those with disabilities. I'd now like to turn this over to the team from Rutgers to discuss some of the major findings of this report and communications.
Thanks, everyone. Our project is called Disability, the Voting Process and the Digital Divide. And I'm glad that Doug and I and Mason are here to talk with you about this. So go ahead, Mason, thanks. So we had three major questions. One, is there a digital divide, the gap in internet use between people with and without disabilities? And what Commissioner McCormick was saying, where do people get information on the voting process and where to vote? And what are the implications of the digital divide for access to voting information? So to answer these and other questions, the EAC asked Rutgers to design and coordinate a national survey of voting eligible citizens, both with and without disabilities, in March and April of 2022. Okay, next. The national sample was based on randomly selected citizens who are eligible to vote. Our survey included many respondents from the 2020 post-election survey, plus some new respondents. The survey was conducted by SSRS, which is a member of the American Association of Public Opinion Research, and the disability measure was based on a 6-question set that's been used by the Census Bureau, plus a 7th broad question to capture other types of disabilities. Next. Just to go on a little bit with the sample, the total sample size of all participants was 2,426. Of that sample, 1,186 had disabilities and 1,240 did not. We oversampled citizens with disabilities because we needed to get a large enough sample to make reliable estimates and be able to break down the sample by disability type and demographics. So I just want to note that the total sample is more than twice the size of typical national phone surveys, which made up of 1,000 people. So our results should generalize well to the disability and non-disability populations. Next. The full report has 23 detailed statistical tables, and we're not going to go through all of those, we promise. All of our results use survey weights to reflect the full disability and non-disability populations. And the report notes which differences are large enough to fall outside the survey's margin of error, so we can be highly confident that true differences exist in the population. So the following slides highlight some of the key results. Next. So disability characteristics of the 2020 survey, the disability sample reflects the overall US disability population. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want to note that half of the people in the disability sample have some type of mobility impairments. And the different types of impairments are well represented in our sample. And it does reflect the overall US disability population. Okay, next. So, eligible voters with disabilities are less likely to use computers or the internet from any location. And you can see use computers or related devices in the disability sample, it's 86% said yes. Without disabilities, 95%, that's a 9% gap. Use the internet, 84% of the disability sample said yes, compared to 95% of the non-disability sample, and that's an 11% gap. This shows that people with disabilities are 3 times more likely not to be internet users, 16% compared to 5%. And based on this, we estimate that 7.5 million eligible voters with disabilities do not use the internet. And that's among the 47.2 million total eligible voters with disabilities. Next. And here's, you can see the disability gap in internet use is the largest among people who are age 65 or older or living in rural areas. So you can see here the number, people with disabilities, 70% use the internet, I'm sorry, they're 65 or older. If they live in rural areas, it's 79%, and that's compared to 82% and 95% compared to people without disabilities. Okay, next. So does the internet make a difference in voting? And yes, it appears that it does. Voter turnout in 2020 was 25 points higher among internet users. And this gap is maintained when we control for demographic characteristics such as age, education, race, gender, and geography. And the strong gap is also maintained when we just look at people with disabilities. So this supports the idea that internet access can encourage voter turnout. And we think it's both through information and also the social connections that can be built up through the internet. Next. So where do voters get information on the voting process in 2020 and where to vote? Primarily from non-internet sources. And you can see any non-internet based source is 71% of people with disabilities, and any internet-based source is 34%. The 3 most popular sources of getting information about voting were printed mailings from the election office, television, and you can see actually a sizable gap here between people with and without disabilities. 25% of people with disabilities are getting their information from television, whereas 16% of people without disabilities are getting their information from TV. And then talking to family members, friends, neighbors, and colleagues, fairly similar. So next. What are the implications? Because of this digital divide, people with disabilities are clearly less likely to use the internet for voting information, and they're more likely to favor non-internet sources, such as TV, printed mailings, and talking to people they know. So the 2 broad takeaways so far are voting information should be provided in multiple formats to make sure that citizens with disabilities can get the information they need to fully participate in elections. And also, given the strong and growing importance of the internet, efforts should be made to shrink that digital divide by expanding internet access for people with disabilities, especially for people who are older or live in rural communities.
Do you think there's a lack of attention being paid to the digital divide, especially for Americans with disabilities?
Yeah, I'll start off with that. Yes, we do think there is. There have been some efforts. There's been some attention, but not enough. The internet is obviously of growing importance in social and political life, but there remains a significant minority of people who don't have internet access, and people with disabilities are disproportionately in this group. You know, as Lisa just showed, 1 in 6 don't use the internet. That's a large chunk of people. Why is there this digital divide? We haven't done a full study of this, but clearly one important factor is economic. People with disabilities have lower incomes on average, and they're more likely to live in poverty, about twice as likely to live in poverty as people without disabilities. And of course, you know, having internet access means having some hardware and then buying the internet access, and that costs money. Yep. Another factor is education. People with disabilities have lower levels of education in general, but we do find that there is a gap in internet access, even controlling for income and education. And I think some of that is probably due to accessibility issues. A lot of technologies just aren't accessible enough for people with disabilities, especially people with vision impairments or dexterity impairments. And it can be not only difficult to keep up with the latest technology, but also expensive to keep up with the latest technology for people with disabilities. So those are some of the things that we think are going on with this digital divide. And obviously there should be more attention to how we expand the internet access.
Thank you. Unless anyone else has any other questions, or any other comments to this, I would ask Commissioner McCormick to ask a question.
Sure. So you touched on this a little bit report, but how does the difference in internet connectivity impact voter behavior?
That's a great question. And clearly, internet users are more likely to vote. And as I said before, it connects you to social media, news platforms, other sources of information that can motivate people to vote. And as a political scientist, I had to kind of break this down into three topics. What gets people to vote? And one is resources. The second one is recruitment. And the third one are psychological factors. And I think having connection to the internet can affect all three. Resources, you gain knowledge, you gain information. Recruitment, people can ask you about voting on particular issues or, bring you in. And psychological factors, because of the greater connections, people and feeling of empowerment, I think people are more motivated to vote.
Yeah, I would just reinforce that. I think there's more of a sense of connection to mainstream society if you're internet connected, if you're participating in social media, and that greater connection to mainstream society makes you more likely to participate in mainstream activities like voting.
Yeah, you're part of the national conversation.
Yeah, it's a great point. Chairman Hicks, do you have another question?
I do. What changes do you feel at the infrastructure level should be considered for elections to be truly accessible for voters with disabilities?
Yeah, I can take this one.
Okay.
As Doug mentioned, it would be good to expand internet access. There needs to be a greater effort in reducing the digital divide by expanding internet accessibility for people with disabilities, particularly those who live in rural areas and for those who have low incomes. But also non-internet tools are vital. Providing information in multiple formats, particularly those used by people with disabilities, for example, television is apparently a major source for people with disabilities, and perhaps election offices could do more to just put public service announcements about the process onto TV stations. These would help ensure that people with disabilities can obtain the information they need to participate in elections fully.
Commissioner McCormick?
So this report is a result of discussion of previous research that you all did. Were there any interesting questions this study raised that could be considered for further research?
Yeah, I can take this one too, if it's all the same with you, Doug and Lisa.
Sure, go ahead.
There were several good questions that were raised as a result of this work. First and foremost, we'd like to focus more on understanding the internet access landscape. Does one region of the US rely more on data plans and non-home-based internet? And what are election offices in areas where internet access is lower doing to control for this gap, to get information out to citizens with disabilities and without disabilities? There was even a thought to perform a qualitative study where through focus groups, semi-structured interviews and such, we might be able to appreciate the experience of people with disabilities and without disabilities in a more nuanced way as it relates to internet access.
Can I just jump in here too?
Sure.
I mean, I think it would be very useful to, first of all, we don't even understand the full picture in the United States of where places have good internet connection and where they don't. So doing a map first, and then kind of formulating best practices for increasing internet access and sharing, regions being able to do some sharing and figuring out what practices seem to work best. So I think those are fruitful areas to explore further.
I'll just add one comment on this. I'm very much a researcher, been researching for several decades now, and always thinking about what might be good research ideas here. With this survey of 2,426 people, we have, I think, a pretty good picture of how people perceive the information sources. We don't know, it would be really interesting to match that up to what different election offices are actually doing. You know, what kinds of methods are they using to put things out? If we could do that kind of match between the voters in a particular district and the election office practices at the district or state level, whatever, then it would be really interesting to see that. That would give us a lot of insight into what practices are most effective. You know, are people perceiving correctly? Well, not correctly. How are people experiencing those practices that the election offices are using? And I think that would be a really powerful research design that would tell us a lot about what practices are most effective.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, that's good information, and we are looking forward to the next segment with Commissioner and Palmer. So thank you so much. Appreciate your report to us, and on to the next phase.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Commissioner Ben Hubland with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. 2022 marks the 32nd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. This landmark legislation was a significant advancement to protect and assist people with disabilities. 32 years is also significant when considering how far technology for elections and communications has come. As technology advances, we need to continually apply the ADA to previously unimagined areas of technology. In 1990, the internet didn't exist in the way we now know it today, and everything from phones to voting equipment has advanced beyond what we could have predicted. As technology evolves, we need to apply accessibility standards to those advances and the changing ways voters, including those with disabilities, use it. Even as the technology improves and access expands, we also have to keep in mind that gaps can exist, and one communication avenue doesn't fit for all voters. I look forward to discussing this issue and more today and in this conversation. Thank you. And with that, I'll pass it over to Commissioner Palmer for remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. I want to thank the Rutgers team for their work on this survey and report. Today, a major factor in community connectivity is access to the internet. The surveys on voters with disabilities in the 2020 election show that there is a digital divide in the access to the internet, particularly in rural communities and voters with disabilities. Unemployed or lower income citizens also find it more difficult to access the internet and communicate or receive information. Rural voters and voters with disabilities also rely on other means of communication and need support in bridging the digital divide. I noted in the survey the high levels of trust in voting information from election offices. This is vitally important because the election office is the proper place to receive the most accurate and current election information. It's also very encouraging. I also noted that voters with disabilities rely on polling places with accessible voting equipment, and that is a major responsibility of election officials. Election officials are also using the internet, television, and different printed materials in their voter outreach to all segments of the society or the community. One thing that stood out to me in the survey was that all voters, including peoples with disabilities, significantly rely on printed materials and for their voting information. Election officials alone cannot close the gap in access to the internet. However, they will continue to use or take those factors into account as they communicate with the public. With the dramatically changing technology in our society, the way we communicate and interact with each other has changed and will continue to change. We must remember digital accessibility. There must be equal opportunity, independence, and self-sufficiency. I hope this report and data shared today will give election officials a better understanding of the communications landscape they are working and offer additional insight as they continue progress that has been made to communicate and serve voters with disabilities. So I'm going to turn this over to the professors from Rutgers for a brief presentation on their findings. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. Just give me 1 second while I put on share access. Okay, then. Thank you again, commissioners. So far, we've been able to illustrate how people with disabilities may be at a disadvantage in finding information on the voting process due to their low likelihood of access to the internet. And this digital divide may contribute to their low levels of voter turnout. So the goal of this panel is to highlight participants' views of voting information sources. In exploring this area, we asked the following questions. How accessible are voting information sources? What information sources do eligible voters prefer to use? How much do they trust different sources? And lastly, how likely are people to vote in fall 2022? And what information sources do they expect to use? So then, starting with accessibility of voting information sources in 2020, despite the technical audits of election websites finding issues with digital inaccessibility, almost all people with and without disabilities rated election office websites as accessible for their needs at 97% and 93% respectively. News and other websites received less favorable views from people with disabilities. 73% of those who used these websites said they were fully accessible, compared to almost all people without disabilities at 93%. Print mailings and newspapers likewise received less favorable views from people with disabilities. 88% of those who used these sources said they were fully accessible, compared to almost all people without disabilities at 96%. And finally, accessibility ratings for election office websites don't vary substantially by the type of disability, but are lower for news and other websites among people with hearing and vision impairments. Now, in regard to where people would prefer to get information on the voting process, approximately 2/5 of participants indicated that they would prefer to get information on the voting process and where to vote from election office websites. But this figure is slightly lower among people with disabilities at 38%, compared to 44% for people without disabilities. People with disabilities are more likely than those without disabilities to prefer getting information from family members, friends, neighbors, or colleagues at 32%, compared to 24% for people without disabilities. Print mailings from the election office at 28% compared to 18%, calling an election office at 27% compared to 23%, or television at 24% compared to 12% for those without disabilities. To frame things differently, that's 18.1 million people with disabilities who would prefer to get information on the voting process from election office websites, 13 million from printed mailings from the election office, and 12.8 million preferring calling the election office. Now, if we look at this idea of trust in information sources on the voting process, we find that respondents were asked the following question and responded as such. How much do eligible voters trust sources of information on the voting process? It seems that the percentage of participants indicating that they highly trust information from the election office is similar between people with disabilities at 49% and those without disabilities at 53%. There also wasn't much of a difference between people with and without disabilities in expressing some trust in receiving voting information from the election office at 24 and 26% respectively. Despite the similar percentages with high and moderate trust in election offices, people with disabilities are more likely than those without disabilities to say that they trust election offices very little or not at all at 25% compared to 19%. The next source with the greatest trust among people with and without disabilities was talking to family members, friends, neighbors, or colleagues at 29% and 28% respectively. This is followed by people with disabilities being more likely than people without disabilities to have high trust in television at 22% compared to 16%. And finally, people with disabilities indicated lower trust in printed newspapers at 21%, relative to people without disabilities at 28%. Now, to decide who to vote for and how to vote on issues in 2020, the most popular sources of information were television, used by 49% of people with disabilities and 35% of people without disabilities, and talking to family members, friends, neighbors, or colleagues, 41% compared to 35%. This is followed by printed letters or newsletters from candidates or organizations, news websites, and printed mailing from election offices. Looking ahead, just over half of people with and without disabilities, 54 and 52% respectively, say that they will definitely vote in 2022. If we frame this differently, that's 25.4 million people with disabilities saying that they would definitely vote in 2022, and 9.1 million who are expressing that we're very likely to vote. The main source people with disabilities expect to use for information on the voting process and where to vote in 2022 is similar to 2020, including talking to friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, television, printed mailings from election offices, election office websites, printed materials from candidates or organizations. So as far as participants possessing an awareness of disability rights is concerned, about 3/4 of respondents believe that information on the voting process is required to be in an accessible format for people with disabilities, though the percent was slightly lower among people with disabilities at 73% than among people without disabilities at 79%. Overall, because people with disabilities are more likely to prefer non-internet sources for voting information, and considering 25 million people with disabilities plan to vote in 2022, it's important to provide this information in multiple formats to help ensure that everyone can obtain the information they need to fully participate in elections. A broader policy implication is that efforts should be made to reduce the digital divide by expanding internet access for people with disabilities, particularly those who have low incomes or live in rural areas. And now that concludes our presentation. I'll turn it over to the commissioners for questions and a meaningful discussion.
Thank you, professors. Really appreciate the presentation and look forward to talking a little bit more about it. One of the things you just mentioned there at the end, and I saw this in the draft report, but talk about the differences with different types of communities. Election officials serve Americans in urban, rural, suburban populations, and can you talk a little bit more about, based on these findings, any recommendations you would have for election officials serving these different types of communities?
Yeah, absolutely. Doug and Lisa, I hope you don't mind. I'll handle that one. This is not a one-size-fits-all situation. The more methods that are used, the higher the probability that each citizen will find a method that works for them. But also, different methods and formats should be used by different election offices to accommodate citizens in acquiring voting information without discrepancy. And what this report shows is that some places and people prefer non-internet means of gathering that information. So something to take note of.
Thank you. Commissioner Palmer?
Sure. In the report you presented to the EAC last summer, you gave detailed information on turnout for voters with disabilities. What's the impact of accessible or inaccessible information on voter turnout?
Well, I'll answer this one. Clearly, if it's physically harder to vote, that's going to discourage voting. If you don't have adequate information, it's going to be more difficult, if not impossible, for you to actually to vote. It also can be very discouraging if people don't have the information they need, or if it's very difficult for them to find the information. You're less likely to feel that you're part of the process if you don't have adequate information. You're more likely to feel disengaged and to say, why should I bother? So I think it can send a very negative message not to have all the necessary information in accessible formats for a variety of people with different types of disabilities.
Thank you.
Doug, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just reinforce that not having information in a variety of contexts, not having information makes people feel powerless.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. Where's my polling place? What do I need to do to vote? And that just makes you feel, as Lisa said, disengaged from the system, and then less likely to exercise your right to vote.
So just following up on that, I mean, I took away from the report that there's expectations from a large amount of the voters with disabilities and without disabilities that they like to receive their information sometimes in a non-digital way. So it might be a voter card, or it might be a mailing. And election officials have to be prepared for that. And they also have to be prepared, for election day and for early voting in a physical way to make sure those systems are available. So that's the big takeaway. I was a bit surprised that so many folks are relying on sort of the physical mailings, but I guess that's why we have a lot of political campaign mailings, because they probably understand this.
I think that's a really good point. Physical mailings seem kind of old school. And I have to admit, I don't always go through my physical mail as much as I should, but I think a lot of people have that reaction. However, we did find, and it's very interesting, as you note, that people with disabilities were more likely than people without disabilities to say they relied on printed material, not only printed material from the election office, but also from candidates, organizations, and, well, simply printed material in the newspaper. People with disabilities are more likely to use the old school physical newspapers.
I was encouraged by the lack of reliance on social media. It's a great way to communicate, but I was encouraged by the fact that they're relying on election offices to get them the official trusted info. And that was very encouraging to me. And I know a lot of election officials that reliance is still there.
I had the same reaction.
Likewise.
I had wanted to ask, I noticed that there were a lot of open-ended questions throughout the survey. And did you see trends in those responses or answers that people provided that would be helpful to election officials regarding how they conduct outreach?
Well, yeah, let me take that. We did have a number of open-ended questions, mostly on, asking people to be specific about, accessibility problems they faced or something like that. I think the most interesting open-ended question we had was at the very end. We asked the question, we thought, let's just ask people, hey, what would you do differently? I have the exact wording of the question here. What, if any, improvements could be made to make it easier for you to get information about voting? And just let people answer however they wanted. And we had about 3/4 of the respondents gave an answer, about 1,800. About 700 of those people said, nothing, I'm fine. I've got all the information I need. But there were another 1,100 or so. And of course, we can provide all the verbatim answers there. There's a great variety there. 8% gave suggestions about mailing more information. They wanted more of that print mailing. 7% about improving websites or internet access. 5% said they should make sure the information is unbiased. 4% talked about information through news or TV. 3% wanted more access to mail-in ballots. There were about 4% who said they wanted more information from the election office. Unfortunately, they weren't very specific. They said the election office should send us more information. About a similar number said they wanted more information through email and texts. There were several number of people who said that we should improve polling place accessibility, which ties into our previous report, obviously. So there was a wide range of answers. Our interpretation from that, there's no one or two solutions that jumped out. Aha, this is exactly what election officials need to be doing. But the wide range of suggestions is kind of consistent with our interpretation that there should be multiple accessible formats. People have a variety of problems, a variety of issues, and so there need to be a variety of solutions to maximize the likelihood that each person can find the way that's best for him or herself.
Thank you for that.
I took away from the report that election officials have to be very flexible in that communication. And I think you really confirmed that. As I looked at the table of statistics and answers, I was struck that 55% of the voters with disabilities cast a ballot at a polling place, and another 10% returned a ballot to a polling place. And so how important is it that election officials communicate, particularly in a redistricting year, about where the polling place is and what accessible equipment is at that polling place?
I think it's crucially important. And the fact that once you get there, that the equipment is actually up and running, that's absolutely key, because the information is a critical first step. And then once you're at the polling place, that's obviously vitally important as well. So what was interesting that struck out to me is that over a quarter of the respondents with disabilities didn't know or didn't think that information, that they were entitled to voting information in an accessible format. So I think right there, you're talking about millions of people. It's crucial to expand the word, to get the word out that yes, you have a right under the law to have voting information provided to you in a way that you can actually access, be able to access it. Again, lack of accommodation, lack of information not only makes it difficult, if not impossible, for people to actually vote, but it sends a message that people with disabilities don't matter. It sends the message that we don't care about whether you vote or not, and that you're not really welcome in this critical political process. So yes, I think it's vitally important.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Commissioner Hovland, did you have another question?
Yeah, obviously we're in an election year. Election officials, their time is limited. And so recognizing that, certainly we hope that a lot of folks are looking at this report. But what would you highlight for election officials as some of the most important takeaways as they look toward the 2022 general and beyond?
I could take this one, Doug and Lisa. I guess it would be good to expand internet access. There's a greater need in reducing the digital divide by extending internet accessibility for people with disabilities, for people without disabilities, but especially for people with disabilities who live in rural areas and for those who do have low incomes. But also non-internet tools are vital. Providing information in multiple formats, particularly those used by people with disabilities, for example, television, is apparently a major source for people with disabilities. And perhaps election offices could do more to put public service announcements about the process onto TV stations. These are the types of things that would help ensure people with disabilities obtain the information they need to participate in elections fully. It's also important to ensure that people with disabilities know that they have the right to accessible information and that that accessible information is provided, in fact. Referring back to an earlier paper in 2015 that Lisa and I and Doug and another co-author of ours published in the Election Law Journal, perhaps it's possible to coordinate with disability groups, including testing whether methods are accessible. Some places have done this with regard to polling place accessibility, so it would be good to replicate these types of collaborations in this case. And finally, while most people with disabilities found election office websites accessible, which is great news, technical audits in previous work have found problems that election offices need to address. So another way to frame it is that while election office websites are accessible today, given the snapshot that we've taken, and in considering how fast technology is advancing, we need to protect that accessibility forever.
Sort of building off of, I was just going to say, building off of that, at the Election Assistance Commission, we work to help states and jurisdictions around the country. Obviously, each state runs elections a little bit different. And so, that's certainly one of the challenges for the work that we do at the EAC. Would you say there are any, or if you had to point to a big takeaway and ways that we could support election officials around the country out of this, or things that we could look to create resources around? Is there a takeaway there that you would point to for my colleagues and I?
That's a good question. I think it really, oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think it really, the EAC should be getting out the word on the things that Mason was just talking about. Right. I don't think there's, substantively different things that the EAC should be doing other than what Mason just talked about. They should be making sure that everyone, all the election offices know that the word should be gotten out that people with disabilities have a right to accessible information as well as accessible polling places. and that it's valuable to partner with disability organizations, as Mason was talking about. I think the EAC can play a very valuable role there.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, there have been studies that have looked at best practices in terms of making polling places accessible. And I think something similar could be done in terms of information practices. So I think it would be very valuable, because different states have different ways of doing it, to, I don't want to say an audit, but to do some kind of study where you look at different practices and you see what seems to be effective, and in different, rural areas, suburban areas, look at all those issues and see, okay, what seem to be the best practices, and can that be shared more broadly among different election officials?
Great, thank you for that. Commissioner Palmer, did you have anything else?
No, I just wanted to thank Rutgers once again for providing this information, the survey, the report, and doing this with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are honored to do this, and I'll just note that in particular, it's the I think, as Commissioner Hovland mentioned, it's the 22nd anniversary of the ADA, and the ADA really established a number of very important disability rights. We do continue to see this disability gap in voter turnout, which is of great concern, and really glad that the EAC is focusing on this and seeing how we can integrate people with disabilities more fully into the political system.
Absolutely, and on our we are in our 20th anniversary year of the Help America Vote Act as well. Both created the EAC, but obviously that important language in HAVA, ensuring that all Americans have the right to vote independently and privately, and we have very appreciative of your work on this and the partnership with Rutgers to help us help election officials as they serve voters all around the country, and so thank you again.
I'd like to once again thank the team at Rutgers for their work on this study and the ongoing contributions to research on voters with disabilities. Moving forward, the EAC will continue to have more discussions on the applications of this research, and we hope to share innovative ways election officials are reaching voters with disabilities in their communities. The EAC also will be working on developing resources for election officials based on these findings that will assist officials. Please visit eac.gov for more information on the materials on accessibility available for voters and election officials. Thank you.